Great, please record. Well, esteemed colleagues, dear friends, greetings to you all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in joining us in this Zoom symposium. I'm Nader El-Bizri, and it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the Knapp Foundation in London for this event that is dedicated to launching our Falsafa project. And I take it now as an opportunity to extend my word of gratitude to Professor Laurence Hemming, Professor Oliver Lehman, Professor Faisal Devji, Professor George Tamer, and Professor Kata Moser for joining us in terms of the sessions and delivering talks and responding as discussants, and also for all of you in being with us in terms of contributing to the fruitful brainstorming sessions together as a group. And now I give the platform to Dr. Aaron Turner, with my thanks also to him for acting as the moderator of our online symposium. And thank you, and looking forward to the discussions as we progress. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nader. Well, it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce our first speaker today, Laurence Hemming. Laurence is a professor of philosophy at Lancaster University and the founder and director of the Knapp Foundation. Professor Hemming's research is primarily focused on the philosophy of Martin Heidegger, particularly Heidegger's engagement with classical Greek thought, and he has written and published mainly in German philosophy, but also medieval theology and in liturgy. He's also a translator of German and Latin texts. Laurence has published widely in these areas, and his monographs include Heidegger's Atheism, published by Notre Dame in 2002, Postmodernity's Transcending by Notre Dame again in 2005, and Heidegger and Marx, A Productive Dialogue Over the Language of Humanism by Northwestern in 2013. He also co-translated Ernst Junger's Die Arbeiter for Northwestern in 2017. So Laurence will open today's symposium with his paper, The Question of Truth, the Falsafa Project and the Research of the Knapp Foundation. Laurence.
Aaron, thank you very much indeed. It's a very great privilege for me to be in such distinguished company today. So thank you. In particular, to be in the distinguished company of my respondents. Kata, I met last year in Lebanon at a symposium in Beirut. But the other colleagues who are joining us are new to me, and but nevertheless far more distinguished than I am. Falsafa names a broad but nevertheless uniquely Arab, if not exclusively Muslim, transmission of a much older term, namely philosophia. It names the way in which Muslim but also Jewish and Christian scholars in what became the Islamic world took up the tradition of Greek thought that arose on the basis of Plato, Aristotle, and the various strands of Neoplatonic and Neo-Aristotelian thought, so decisive for that region of the world that I am very loosely going to begin by calling Europe or the West. I hope to indicate how unstable, we might even say narrowed, these latter names of Europe and the West have become. In naming Falsafa, the Knapp Foundation today launches what is for us one of our most important and long-planned areas of research, one we believe to be of great importance. We intend this project to unfold over several years and cover a great deal of ground. Some of what we want to explore is very well documented and understood, although not always widely known. Other aspects of this project are much less clearly researched. There will therefore be two aspects to this undertaking. First, to make much more publicly and clearly available an existing body of knowledge. And second, to show and in some cases undertake where there is more work to be done. In this opening paper, I want to say a little of why this project is of such importance to us and how it connects with our other work. Let me begin, however, by saying what this and being very clear about what this project is not. Although explicitly theological questions will and do arise in Falsafa, this project is in no way a theological project, nor does it have an interfaith aspect. Although the three religions of the book, the Abrahamic religions, have each also become bound up with the fate and the historical unfolding of what flows to us from Greek antiquity in Philosophia. What has been decisive in this history and has emerged from it as philosophy has paradoxically had little to do with divine revelation. To take just the example of Christianity, especially in Northwestern Europe and North America, the preoccupation of systematic and philosophical theology has for several centuries up to the present day been quite unironically an attempt to decide in advance the conditions, the philosophical conditions, under which God might be God, whilst claiming to continue to be faithful to the experience of divine self-revelation. This strikes me as a great paradox in contemporary theology, and one of the reasons why I would no longer really call myself any kind of a theologian. On the other hand, the Falsafa project may very well throw light on the effect of each of the religions of Judaism, of Christianity, and Islam that each has had on the other. Now, this is far from fanciful. One only has to consider how, under the terms I've already suggested, the modern or so-called secular world has transformed the self-understanding of revealed religions to understand how they also might have influenced each other. So just as it is possible to trace the effects that Christianity had on the emergence of modern strands of Judaism, so in ways that I think have barely been considered with any breadth, there have been individuals who've thought about this, but their work is little known. Islam may also have profoundly altered the direction and self-understanding of certainly some forms of Christianity, and especially those in Western and Northern Europe, and possibly Islam influenced even Judaism as well, although I'm less qualified to speak about that. Greek antiquity singled out and identified no formal topic of the investigation into, nor the description of, the divine as the divine. By the word theologia, Aristotle, especially and his successors, mean a mode of being. That means a mode of presence, rather than consideration of any specific defined figure. If, to be sure, for the Greeks, the gods are athanatos, and they are athanatoi, this is from the inception of Greek thought, especially in Homer and in the poets, a way of speaking of the realm from which the gods emerge and the realm of human experience of them, rather than saying anything about their character or actuality as gods. What distinguishes the emergence of metaphysics in Western Europe from the Middle Ages onwards is an already prepared encounter between revealed religion and Greek antiquity that transformed that term of Aristotle's, theologia, and the theological from a means of talking about being and presence into discourse about the divine itself. And that encounter was a Jewish, Christian, and Islamic encounter, but it was an encounter that was largely felt in its effects rather than its working out, especially on the Western side of Europe. The emergence of Falsafa, or rather the thinkers who constituted it, was not merely an important, but I want to suggest a decisive step along this path, especially in the course of the emergence of Christian metaphysics. And by that I'm thinking, let's take for an example Suarez, as a Western rather than an Eastern European phenomenon. Here, however, it is necessary to take two further important steps back. For the emergence of Philosophia in the forms it took at Aristotle's and Plato's hands was not an inception as such, but itself a step along the way from something entirely earlier and more decisive, but which I want to suggest has only until very recently become visible for itself, and even now is difficult to see. For one example, for a very long time, Plato's dialogue, the Parmenides, was presumed to be a faithful representation of the doctrines of the Eleatics and of Zeno and Parmenides in particular, but and possibly along with them Melissos, Xenophanes, and Empedocles. Now, while there had been intermittent interest in the extant fragments of the earliest thinkers of the Greeks from the 16th century onwards in assorted compilations, the enormous steps taken by 19th century German philology, above all figures like Christian Brandis, who was an influence on Hegel, Johannes Classen, Friedrich Müller, and Edward Zeller, these all resulted in the scholarly edition of Parmenides' fragments of Hermann Diels in 1897, Parmenides' Lehrgedicht, or dogmatic poem, a work later taken over and incorporated into Diels' magisterial collections of what he called pre-Socratic fragments in 1903, that were further revised by Walter Krantz in 1922. Philosophy itself was transformed by the emergence of the importance of these fragments. Hegel remarked in his History of Philosophy that not a word of his logic was written without reference to Heraclitus. Others, Erwin Roder, Jakob Burckhardt, and above all Friedrich Nietzsche, who was among the first to lecture specifically on the pre-Platonic philosophers, were also decisive. And then we would have to add the name of Wilhelm Dilthey. What emerged from this frankly quite new departure in classical philology was not pre-Socratic philosophy as such, although it often bears that name, but the ability to see the earliest developments of philosophy at all, its beginnings, in above all the figures of Parmenides, Heraclitus, Anaximander, Empedocles, and others. Empedocles still very under-researched, in my opinion. And these were liberated to speak, not as Plato and Aristotle had reported them, but rather for themselves, and for the first time in perhaps 26 centuries. Parmenides, it becomes clear, is the first to single out the Greek word aletheia, a word we now often translate as truth, and consider it thoughtfully for itself. This word, of course, was already in Homer, along with related and interchangeable terms, etumos, or thotis, and the Greek verbs enai, on, being, as ways of speaking of both of what is true and what, as true, is. While the use of aletheia gains strength in the poetic tradition with figures like Theognis, Mimnermus, Simonides, and others, it is Parmenides, whose relics, by the way, also appear to us in poetic meter, who singles the term out and allies aletheia in thoughtful terms, what we will later call philosophy, to the goddess Dike. Karl Reinhardt, whose friendship with Martin Heidegger appears to have been lifelong, was the first, with his publication in 1916 of Parmenides und die Geschichte der griechischen Philosophie, Parmenides and the History of Greek Philosophy, to make the audacious observation that Parmenides had presented his discussion of what we now call truth, not as singular, but through three paths, or hodoi. These three are named by the goddess Dike as first, aletheia itself, the truth or disclosure of what is, that being is. Second, that non-being is not, a path that mortals can never travel. And third, that truth is the opinions of mortal men and women in doxa, opinion. She calls this last, doxa, she says, the trodden paths of mortals, the opinions of mortals. Where what is and what is not, that second way, is mixed up in the ability of mortal men and women to bring understanding to stability and to clarity. Now, this elucidation of the interpretation of Parmenides, whose outlines Martin Heidegger later said he had also reached at about the same time, and which, in ways still to be fully understood, were decisive for the entire history of Heidegger's own oeuvre, laid the basis for a revolutionary understanding of Plato and Aristotle, especially for the dialogues The Sophist and Theaetetus, and for Aristotle's metaphysics. That truth should essentially appear in this threefold manner attends the entire tradition that follows on from it, even when not fully understood, and in ways that I can only today gesture at and point to, but I hope to indicate as we proceed. Central to each of the research endeavors of the Knapp Foundation has been the question of truth, and therefore the question of what grounds our areas of inquiry in each case. Falsafa is only one of several. Our concern has been to return to the question of the understanding of truth, of how the way what we inquire into finds its foothold. That is to say, that what is to be understood, what is true, appears in some way often doubly, both as the way a thing is and the way it manifests in discourse. Now, you could say that this, to some extent, corresponds in medieval thought to the ordo ascendi and the ordo cognoscendi, although I wouldn't make make it too precise a mapping. And so the way that what is understood in discourse is the way something is generally and broadly understood. You hear in that the echo of the goddess's remark, the paths and opinions of mortal men and women. And that this twofold of the way something is and the way it manifests itself in discourse has laid out the path for how we conduct each of the inquiries that we undertake. The question of ground also appears as the pursuit of the order of inquiring. Again, that medieval word ordo. Finding out what lies prior, what makes what possible. Does the more general understanding make the way a thing is possible, or is it the other way around? Let me therefore suggest that in fact discerning the actual and historical appearance of a phenomenon, the way it manifests itself as the way it has manifested itself over time, is the more decisive of the two, since how something is generally understood is only possible on the basis of its actual historical unfolding, the actual appearing of the phenomenon itself. Now, this is the first of the two steps back I have named. In the case of Falsafa, how do we exhibit the ground of what Falsafa names? And in so doing, how do we show what decisive steps are to be made in the unfolding of its own history? This brings me to the second step I named earlier. I said that what is decisive for us in the Falsafa project is that region of the world I have already very loosely referred to Europe or the West. This claim runs directly contrary to the contemporary and general understanding of the history, both of Islam and what has been more widely called the Islamicate. Foremost in this has been Edward Said's postulation of the concept of Orientalism and the set of narratives that we might loosely constitute as decolonial. Said tells us the European encounter, this is Said, the European encounter with the Orient, and specifically with Islam, strengthened this system of representing the Orient and turned Islam into the very epitome of an outsider against which the whole of European civilization from the Middle Ages on was founded. Now, there are several observations I would like to make about this quotation. First, it arises on the basis of a concept of Europe that is, strictly speaking, modern, and most importantly, not predating at the earliest, I would suggest, 1650, and really that is a Europe of the late 18th and 19th centuries, and that decisively locates the West as simply that region which encompasses what we would in fact only call Western and above all Northwestern Europe, namely the trio of nations and their immediate satellites represented by the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, and their subsequent extension into North America and Australasia and other lands. Somewhat tongue-in-cheek, therefore, it could be possible to argue that this region is a product not of Islam's exclusion from Europe, but rather of Islam's success as a European presence. Since with Scandinavia, which for complex reasons not discussable here, does not really figure in this narrative, these are the only countries, the UK, France, and Germany, that were never, or almost never, since we should never forget the Eastern Mediterranean regions we now consider French that were touched by Islam. These three countries were the only ones never really touched by invasions by Islamic powers. Second, the representation of the Orient with which Said is concerned is itself a very recent phenomenon, largely a construct of the 19th century and its political machinations, with little or no historical antecedent, despite his earnest attempts to argue to the contrary. Third, this concept of Europe ignores the history of Europe as the inheritor of both Greek antiquity and I would say all three, of the religions of the book. It focuses on Europe as a Christian affair in which other religions appear as visitors or outsiders. Now, while Said is, I think, entirely correct to argue that this Europe that posits its Oriental wing as a phantasm is the modern way that Europe understands itself, I want to suggest that this self-understanding has no basis, and I repeat, no basis in the actual history of the emergence of Europe as a whole. This narrow, contemporary Europe is the triumph of the extension of a certain seizing of the globe, a seizing of the globe as a whole for the sake of technological and technocratic control, a Europe of the organization of the production and consumption and of economic rationalization, a Europe, therefore, that seeks to slip the moorings of its own genuine history and so forget its own grounds. And by forgetting its own grounds, I mean the physicality. For it cannot be denied that in the current arrangements of what has come to be called geopolitics, there does indeed lie a genuine basis for what Said argues, that governments of states with predominantly Muslim populations have indeed been held at bay or kept in second place to the prevailing West, the blocks of power represented by North America, by the so-called European powers, and that means narrow Western Europe I've described, and even by the intricacies of machination currently surrounding China and the Russian Federation and its allies. Said himself admitted in a commentary written in the year of his death that he says Orientalism is very much a book tied to the tumultuous dynamics of contemporary history. He says, I emphasize in it accordingly that neither the term Orient nor the concept of the West has any ontological stability. Each is made up of human effort, partly affirmation, partly identification of the other. Said quite conventionally understands the geographical or geopolitical to be an imaginary, in consequence of the distribution and effects, and of his own word, power. The secular world, he says, is the world of history as made by human beings. He concludes, and I quote him one last time, that the cultural historical phenomenon of Orientalism is a kind of willed human work. Now, this is a thesis that Karl Marx would have been entirely happy with. Said is right to it, not that I'm suggesting he's a Marxist. I'm not making that suggestion at all. Said is right to address the seething cauldron of contemporary political life, the global seizing and arrangement of the planet as an ontological instability, what Ernst Junger and Martin Heidegger both called a Verwüstung, a devastation, and Karl Marx described with the words that it was a bourgeois phenomenon in which all that is solid melts into air. But is it correct to understand the West and its phenomenal appearance through its opposites? And in the case of Falsafa and Islam, the Orient constituted as a willed human work. For I repeat, the West at issue here is hardly the Europe of antiquity, of, let us say, Aeschylus, and you'll see in a minute why I don't choose Aeschylus idly. If contemporary opinion, that third way of the goddess, conceives of the West as what follows geopolitically from the blocks of powers represented by North America, by the European powers, opposed by China and Russia, to understand Falsafa means to step back into a far older and more difficult question, much harder and much more concentrated in addressing it. Why Greece? And how and why does Greece and none other lie at the basis of this older Europe? And as I've already indicated, the basis of much Islamic thinking. Geopolitics emerged as a discipline not from the analysis of modern constitutions and relations of power between states, but at the hands of geographers like Ratzel, Curl, Naumann, and later Kjellén, and finds its Anglophone pinnacle in the Scotsman Halford Mackinder. When we ask the question, why Greece, we ask not only why, but also how the Greek tradition of thought became integral to the foundation of what Falsafa is also part of the history of. The answer to the question, why Greece, is not at all self-evident. Greece is by far not the most ancient civilization. It was easily arguable to say that it's preceded by the Egyptian or the Akkadian or Babylonian, but also by the civilizations of the East, of China, Japan, or of Persia, of the Indian subcontinent, and many others on the African and American continents. Mackinder and others. Mackinder suggests that what we now narrowly conceive of as Europe, with the lands it colonized and took over during what he calls the Columbian Age, has as mere territory or as mere sets of constitutions and political arrangements alone been poorly understood. He adds, and this is Mackinder, I ask you, therefore, he says, for a moment to look upon Europe and European history as subordinate to Asia and Asiatic history. For European civilization is, in a very real sense, the outcome of the secular struggle against Asiatic invasion. In this, he's identifying the real power relation. By secular, he means not, as with Said, contemporary, but rather in its older meaning of perennial, and therefore something expressed over millennia. Europe is the condensation and consequences of the ceaseless movements of Asiatic peoples. Many recent other authors have also addressed this thesis, some of them without recapitulating the same thesis Mackinder outlines, without direct reference to him. You will find this in Christopher Beckwith's work, or Warwick Ball's and Barry Cunliffe's, all of them advanced versions of Mackinder's thesis. This movement of peoples across the steppe, across the centuries, is what gave rise to Greece and what gave rise to the modern world. And Mackinder made a powerful case for the interconnection of the sea basins and land masses of Western antiquity as an effect of events that he says took place on, and I quote, the continuous landmass of Euro-Asia, and thus included between the ocean and the desert, which measures 21 million square miles, or half of all the land on the globe. The movement on the peoples of this vast landmass so stirred and united Europe that we may account them as the beginning of modern history, another striking instance of European advance stimulated by the necessity of reacting against pressure from the heart of Asia. So why does Greek antiquity assume such a place of importance in the origination of the West? And why is what is Greek continually appropriated by Rome, by Jewish, Christian, and Islamic intellectual traditions? And why is it marked by the rise of neoclassicism in its multitude forms from the late Middle Ages up to the present day? This question, why, implies no necessity, no inevitability, no principle of causation, no principle of progress, no advance as superiority, but rather manifests itself in its actual how, the first way of Parmenides' goddess, what actually happened. How and in what ways did Greece come about and continue its presence in this West, this Abrahamic West, and in what and how it thinks? The original geographers and thinkers of what became geopolitics thought not in terms of imaginaries or constructs, but of the actual shape of land masses, or the interrelationship between landmass, the seas, waterways, the climate, and the revolution of the seasons. Mackinder and others proposed a way of thinking of the globe that begins with the interactions of, he says, the atmosphere, hydrosphere, and lithosphere, taking into account great worldwide forces, the sun's heat and the Earth's rotation on its axis, and the ellipticity of the Earth's orbit and the obliquity of its axis. It is difficult not to hear in this description the interactions of the rhizomata of Empedocles, stripped of their Aristotelian interpretation as a kind of alchemy, the later suggestion that everything was some kind of physical combination of the stoicheia, or elements, a word Empedocles himself never gives in what remains of him. Mackinder adds, everywhere political questions will depend on the results of the physical inquiry. Certain conditions of climate and soil are needed for the aggregation of dense populations. A certain density of population seems necessary to the development of civilizations. What is required is the reaction, by which he means interreaction, the very being in the midst of humanity on nature, to establish the character, we might say the presence, the very being of the communities of the earth. The Europe of antiquity did not exclude, but rather took for granted the incorporation of the whole of the Mediterranean rim, from the Maghreb in the west to the Levant and Syria in the east, extending eventually all the way over to the western seaboard of the Caucasus, the ancient Colchis, including Lower Egypt and much of what we would now call the Middle East. It is in these regions, modern-day Syria, Iraq, Egyptian North Africa, and later the Iberian Peninsula, and what came to be called the Sicilian Emirate, that what came to be also called Falsafa, as the inheritance of Greek antiquity, was preserved, and in which it thrived, and subsequently was handed on. And the point here is it was handed on only to the west of Europe, because the east of Europe often already had it. Although it is possible only to allude to it without examining it in detail, the encounter with Islam of that advancing pressure from Asia, let us say of the Mongolian and Turkic and other Asiatic inroads into Europe, especially in the murky and poorly documented and little understood establishment of various kinds of kingdom in, let us say, the Crimea or the Caucasus, in modern-day Ukraine, in Kuban, and in Central Asia, is the result of the encounter of these invaders with an Islam that they encountered on their way into arrival, and so not necessarily always one they brought with them. Becoming Muslim was part of their inroad into Europe. The Volga Bulgars, for instance, who eventually became Christian, were almost certainly originally Muslim. Almost as an aside, the instrumental figure of Volodymyr, so revered in the story of the Christian conversion of Rus, of modern-day Russia and Ukraine, can be claimed variously also by Jewish and Muslim sources as having been at least at some point one of their own. Such a history, integral to the history of Falsafa itself, requires a very different concept of Occident and Orient, far broader and more complex than we are accustomed to from contemporary sources, or the distribution of power across constructed spaces. It is the centuries-long actuality, the actual unfolding of Falsafa in Europe, that discloses that Islam and its intellectual tradition is not an outsider, but an insider to, and a constituent part of, what we have now come to call Europe and the West. For we must keep in view that not one, but two ways in which truth unfolds are integral to the essence of truth as it is explained and laid down by Parmenides. Here we exclude the way of non-being, which the goddess says cannot be traveled. It is the unfolding of these two ways, together with that form the history of truth itself, and with which Falsafa is unbreakably involved. Now, Said makes much of what he believes to be the modern consequence of an attitude he traces to classical Greece and its inheritance in Rome. He understands the division between the Greek and Roman world and the Asiatic world to be grounded in a separation that he says existed, and I quote him, to prove that Romans and Greeks were superior to other kinds of people. And he cites Aeschylus, hence my mention of Aeschylus not being innocent earlier. Above all, Aeschylus is the Persians as evidence for this, although he adds the Bacchae. We may say that the position Said identifies is attested above all in Hegel's philosophy of world history, that flawed pinnacle of metaphysical speculation, the historical working out of the consequences of Hegel's logic that asserts above all the superiority of the German encapsulation of the Greek inheritance, with no account, by the way, of how the Germans came to be Greece's inheritors, and that reaches its apogee through Kojève and Fukuyama in the postulation of the end of history. Put simply, the end of history becomes the condition for the triumph of that understanding of the West that satisfies the condition of humanism, of a globalized project of liberal democracy and economic stability. It is precisely this understanding that Heidegger believed to be a devastation, and which led Heidegger to launch his attack on the very concept of humanism. Yet Said roots himself in humanism, a humanism that Heidegger had rooted in Plato, and the inception of metaphysics in Plato's understanding of truth, one that undermined the meaning of what is present for the sake of a beyond, a supersensible of the ideas. It is easy to recognize in Said's account the devastation of Heidegger's claim. For Said, and this is my concluding point, misses the point of Aeschylus's tragedy. The Persians does not celebrate a hubris, namely the victory of superior Greeks over the inferior Asiatic Persians, as a moment of the birth of the extraneous Orient. We've already seen from the geographer's account of the formation of Greece that Greece is itself an effect of Asiatic movement. It is integrally a consequence of what simultaneously produces and threatens it. This process of threat and production does not cease, but repeats itself in European history even to this day. This is not its outside, it is its very being. The undecided question is the question of what, the question of the what that is threatened. Is it the superiority of European life as such that is threatened, what we've sometimes come to call European Eurocentrism or European superiority or some aspect of that? In which case, why should this not be decided merely by a contest within the will to power? What is it that stands threatened in the contemporary situation? Is it truth? In what form? As the mere exchange of opinions, your world, your values, your way of life, your economic organization versus ours, whoever you and we are? Are Greeks really simply superior to Persians? Are we all not human? And should therefore there not be unity among humans in a common humanity? The central thesis of humanism. It is difficult not to hear in this a degree of triviality, a superficiality that glosses over the actual and historical occurring that each of us is in the history and being that we are, namely that we make present in our being. Heidegger threw into relief Plato's understanding of truth and what he called the fateful decision to understand truth, because the account of truth that emerged within metaphysics simply addressed what was present in its mere presence, and could not show in what way it had come about, through disclosure, aletheia, there's the alpha privative of aletheia itself. Thus, the mere superiority of one way of life over another, as you find in Hegel, provides no understanding of either way of life, either the inferior or the superior. To tell me that you are superior to me without showing me how I have unfolded into our respected life, the lives we lead, the life world that we lead, is the mere exchange of opinion and says nothing at all. It is very much the goddess's third way, the opinions of mortal men and women. To show how each of us has unfolded and in what ways and with what we are confronted and what our possibilities for being are, is itself the unfolding of the truth of each of us, a genuine disclosing of ourselves and to each other. In this, we should hear the contrasted paths of Parmenides, of aletheia and doxa, which belong to each other, but where one explains the other and takes priority, not in value, but in capacity for understanding. In this, aletheia does lie prior to doxa, because aletheia as disclosure explains how, in the unfolding of what actually is, it can be taken for less than it is in mere opinion. In the Persians, after the report of the defeat of Xerxes, the chorus taunts the Persian queen by saying, "Not long will those in the land of Asia remain under Persian rule. It continues, nor must mortals keep their opinions, glossa, under guard, for the people have been set free to speak with precision, badzein, freely. The attribution to Aeschylus of a Greek hubris is anachronistic. The Persians invaded with vastly superior force, not as strangers, but all too recognizably as advancing tyrants. It is the Greeks, with their ability to speak directly and sharply, badzein, precisely in speaking of how things are, that let what must be said be said. And these, the Greeks, are because of that strange. They are strange because they have no need of tyranny, but are led from within themselves. For the polis is not founded in happiness, nor contentment, nor comfort. These are all the attributes of tyranny. All of these things are not strange, but were well known to the Greeks and the Persians alike. What is strange is freedom. Freedom to let things be spoken of as they are, and not as the tyrant directs or wills. One might note that this very freedom, this unleashed freedom for things to be as they are, is what lies at the heart of the metaphysical experience of the Abrahamic God. It is tyranny that insists that things are kept hidden and live in their unknowing, their unessence, their not reality, and therefore non-being. This verb badzein, sharpness of speech, is derived from baino, to go forward, even to step or step up. The people step forth in freedom by means of what can now be said from a basis, a foothold in the way things really are. Basis is also related to baino and badzein. The people know and can speak of what and how they know what is. The victory over Xerxes extends the freedom of the Greeks to let what is to be seen as it is from a firm grounding, and this is extended even to the Persians themselves. The defeat of Xerxes opens the Persians to the strangeness of the Greeks. Now, this thesis can be found in Herodotus. In commenting on Parmenides' fragments, Heidegger notes the close connection between glossa, the opinions of the everyday, and what is to be brought to speech in logos as what is to be disclosed, namely, that which is to be said sharply and precisely, placed on a firm footing and basis, given its ground, all of Aeschylus's badzein. Heidegger notes the unfolding of truth, aletheia, is not a method, not an opinion, but the goddess aletheia, he says, liberating, inasmuch as she thrusts out into the open realm to let what is be seen as it is. The Falsafa project is therefore a twofold project. It aims both to bring back into the open realm the history of the Arab Islamic contribution to the unfolding of the West itself, as the preservation of an understanding of truth from its Greek inception and to the present day, not a hubris, but a path of preserving what was most preciously received. And added to this, the Falsafa project itself aims to stand in that tradition of speaking truly, as a constitutive part of that tradition. It therefore aims to bring back into the open the history of a very different Europe, if by Europe we mean the Europa, that the geographers began to make visible as the unfolding of an inception and history of a thinking in a place and region not defined through an imaginary, nor through a rational process, but as itself an actuality, a history, and a time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurence. There's no good way to do a round of applause on Zoom, is there? I'm delighted now to introduce our second speaker. Nader El-Bizri is a professor of history of science and philosophy and has been serving as the Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Sharjah. He is an affiliated scholar with the University of Cambridge and a senior research fellow of the Knapp Foundation. Professor El-Bizri's main areas of research focus on Arabic sciences and philosophy, mainly Avicenna, Al-Hazin, Brethren of Purity and the History of Metaphysics, and the traditions of phenomenology and ontology, particularly Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty. Nader has published widely in these areas, including The Phenomenological Quest between Avicenna and Heidegger with SUNY Press in 2000, Epistles of the Brethren of Purity on Arithmetic and Geometry, published with Oxford in 2012. And in 2018, he co-edited The Occult Sciences in Pre-Modern Islamic Cultures, published by Ergon. Nader's paper today is titled The Falsafa Project and Modern Scholarship in Arabic Sciences and Philosophy. Nader.
Thank you, Dr. Turner, and good afternoon again to everyone. I'm really delighted to be with you and to have the chance of sharing with you some thoughts around the Falsafa project and trying to tie it also to modern scholarship in the academic domain of Arabic sciences and philosophy, grosso modo. The Falsafa project itself has been developed as a theme of research out of various discussions and activities that were unfolding during the period of the founding of the Knapp Foundation in London and in what follows through the occasion of its launch and events that accompanied that. It is therefore in confluence with the mandate of the Knapp Foundation along the lines that were shared with you in the paper of Professor Laurence Hemming with its philosophical orientations. And this rests also on long-standing dialogues that I used to have with my dear friend Laurence around Heidegger's critique of metaphysics and the history of classical ontology. In my own intervention, I aim at adding further particulars about this interdisciplinary project, which constitutes a principal research strand within the foundation. And today's session is marked as an occasion for launching the Falsafa project and the interventions that we are having, including the discussions with our respondents and questions and answers that we received from you, will act also as a basis for engaging in brainstorming discussions between us over the themes of the project and the prospects of future collaborations. Now, the project around Falsafa intersects with the established academic domains of Arabic Islamicate intellectual history, even if it involves other forms of scholarly pursuits, investigations, and intellectual reflections. One of the main aims is to raise questions around the reified positing of Islam as an external otherness with respect to what has come to be called the West. The focal pathway in approaching this phenomenon is mediated via philosophical thinking that is inspired by intellectual history. And this builds on the established and growing scholarship on the pre-modern Arabic Islamicate Falsafa, with a focus on the impact of its strands on the history of ideas and material culture in Europe, in the domains of the letters, arts, and sciences. Studying the transmission, translation, and adaptive assimilation of the Arabic Islamicate corpus of knowledge in Europe from the High Middle Ages to the Renaissance continues to expand, and it's gaining greater visibility in academia. And many of our esteemed and distinguished colleagues who are present with us are scholars who are driving this field and expanding its impact. The philosophical orientations of the Falsafa project aim at complementing these approaches that also evoke methodologies that rest on historiography, philology, comparative literature, while also reflecting on the significance of intellectual history in dealing with philosophical questions in our contemporary era. We reflect on the extent in which such historical and textual studies can have relevance in our consideration of the grounds of commonality and identity across synergistic cultures, religions, and languages. And this endeavor of historicity avoids historicism, anachronism, in being itself driven by a philosophical take on history. This sheds light into the way philosophical concepts evolved not only in the medieval era or in the Renaissance period and the Baroque, but how they reconfigured the advent of early modern forms of knowledge. So the impact of the likes of Avicenna, Averroes, Alhazen, Maimonides on European scholasticism, and on figures of the standing of Aquinas, Grosseteste, Roger Bacon, Vitello, Ghiberti, is well known and is being documented to greater levels of detail via historical commentaries, editions, translations, efforts in hermeneutic and exegetical interpretations. What complements such lines of scholarship requires further philosophical investigation in terms of probing its conceptual, theoretical, epistemic, and ontological prolongations when studying also philosophers like Descartes, Kant, and Hegel. The relevance of pointing to a common philosophical ground has its roots in seeing the Falsafa legacy as a principal strand in the Greco-Roman, Arabic, Latinate heritage, from antiquity till early modernity, along with tracing its epistemological and ontological impacts that reach the modern era. Such approach goes beyond the enriching contributions of scholarship in documentation, archiving, historiography, philology, and comparative studies, which myself, along with many of you, have dedicated most of our academic efforts to focus on these endeavors and pursuits. The impetus of bringing a philosophical thinking to bear on the principal concepts and ontology, epistemology, and theories of value that we could derive and engage with when dealing with this intellectual history would constitute a major aspect of the Falsafa project. This outlook deepens also the focus on the attributes of the common ground of philosophical thinking. And this endeavor goes deeper than the comparative and culturally sensitive approaches in the emergent subfields of world philosophies, which we are seeing now emerging with some visibility in various platforms of philosophy that focus on Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy, Japanese philosophy, African philosophy. This also points to foundational aspects that aim at disclosing more illuminating conceptual frameworks than those that are advocated culturally through the current critical constructs and institutional efforts to decolonize the academic curriculum in universities, or even how it is impacting the way scholars conduct their research. The effort also of dealing with these questions through the Falsafa project contributes furthermore to a deepened philosophical thinking about the nature of common groundings than what is practiced in our era in terms of intercultural and inter-religious dialogues. With all the merits and impact that they are bringing, they require deepened philosophical engagements with the themes that they reflect upon or have a locus of dialogue around them. When thinking about Falsafa as a philosophical legacy in the Islamicate classical and post-classical contexts, we evoke the religious, ethnic, and linguistic diversities that underpinned it. After all, Muslim scholars were in interaction with Christian, Jewish, Sabaean interlocutors in how they all preserved, transmitted, translated, adapted, and expanded the Greek philosophical and scientific ideas of seminal figures such as Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, Euclid, Ptolemy, Galen, Archimedes, and how this ultimately impacted the history of ideas in Europe, whether in philosophy, theology, the sciences, and the architectural arts, from the High Middle Ages to the early modern period and beyond. This Greek, Arabic, Latin legacy underpins the curricula of European universities as a long-standing tradition. And when we consider the Greek corpus itself, it's not simply associated with the islands of Greece and its mainland peninsula. We look at it also from the perspective that it is a constellation of intellectual legacies from the Eastern Mediterranean and the Hellenistic diaspora. And this brings with it indigenous Egyptian and Levantine multifaceted schools and traditions from Alexandria, Miletus, Antioch, Gerasa, Byblos, Harran, which subsequently grounded the cultures of late antiquity. It is this Mediterranean corpus that was adopted and expanded through the Arabic sciences and philosophies via the efforts of Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Sabaean scholars of Arabic, Syriac, Persian, Iberian, Turkish backgrounds. Many principal oeuvres of this vast Arabic Islamicate corpus of knowledge were translated and adaptively assimilated into European Latinate circles of learning, as transmitted to Europe via Andalusia, Sicily, in part via the Crusades and interactions with Byzantium, with diverse ethnic, linguistic, religious, and cultural practices across geographies that stretched from Andalusia to India. The realms of shared ideas were marked by commonalities across diverse territories, lifestyles, and forms of governance. So the grounding of historical philosophical identity in relationship to this heritage is not a mere construct. It rather emerges out of reflections on centuries of intellectual confluences around the Mediterranean, with concreteness in its geographical and historical determinations, and in terms of its impact on Europe. The Arabic Islamicate legacies had as such a decisive historical influence on the European Judeo-Christian traditions and on the secular praxis that began to unfold through the early modern period and onwards. These aspects are nowadays vital for any discussions that are intercultural and active globally in our modern life world, with its cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural, and multilingual expressions. The Falsafa project aims also at thinking furthermore about the lasting influence of the Arabic Islamicate realms of ideas on European thought from the early modern period and what comes afterwards, in what came to shape the conceptual rudiments of modernity, which is not to be measured only by the unfolding of technoscience. This ultimately points also to the prolongation of the interchange of ideas between the Christianized Aristotelianism and going beyond it with the advent of the theories of Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, Descartes, Kant, Hegel, Darwin. While the history of the impact of the Arabic Islamicate corpus on European thought and material culture is becoming well documented, much more visible through the subfields of medieval and Renaissance studies or in Islamic studies, the philosophical examination of the living aspects of this legacy are not clearly articulated. Dealing with this critical matter is part of the Falsafa project without being constrained by the technocratic drive of the public policies of multiculturalism, which despite their visibility, do not always aim at tracing the intellectual synergies that constitute a common philosophical ground of intellectual belonging and identity. The precise direction of the Falsafa project is still in its inception phase, and by launching this endeavor through today's event, we seek your input in terms of discussions and reflections on prospective collaborations. This requires various integrated studies on the Arabic reception, adaptation, and expansion of the Greek traditions and knowledge, and their transmission and prolongations in Europe till the early modern period and beyond. The aim is to develop a philosophical outlook on Falsafa as a locus of intellectual synergies and a shared intellectual heritage that does not conceal the diversities within its folds in terms of its ethnic, religious, linguistic, cultural, historical, and geographical attributes. The Falsafa project deals therefore with multiple strands. It focuses on the historical adaptation and expansion of the Greek corpus in the Arabic Islamic classical milieu and on its historical transmission in Europe. And it also addresses the unfolding of post-classical Islamicate bodies of knowledge that reached the modern era, not only in the Arab milieu, but also in Ottoman, Persian, Indian contexts. This evokes issues that develop as well in terms of reflections on phenomena of colonialization, westernization, secularism, multiculturalism, fundamentalism, technocracy, globalism, without positing counterfactual hypotheses in approaching them. While scholarship places the Arabic Islamic sciences and philosophies within their classical and post-classical milieu as intellectual heritage, we aim at thinking of them also as a living legacy. The investigation of Falsafa as a historical tradition within the curricula of mainstream academia and area studies are not yet very visible in many of the philosophy departments. And the general direction in scholarship is still marked in some of its aspects by a penchant towards historicism and some form of antiquarian approach in scholarship. The aims and objectives of the learned and recognized exegetes, which I have the great honor and privilege to be working with many of them, differ also at times from the purposes of philosophers who focus on the evolution of concepts and on the fundamental questions of ontology, epistemology, logic, value theory, while still deploying the methods of historiography and philology in the analysis of text and in tracing their channels of transmission. The methods of the classicist and medievalist scholar in analyzing the Greek and Latin texts has influenced ultimately the academic approaches in Arabic and Islamic studies as well, without this amounting to claims that can be articulated always from the perspective of evoking Orientalism or Eurocentrism. Albeit contemporary Islamic thought deals itself with the lived problems of sociopolitics, ethics, and the applications of the religious law, while being based itself on traditionalist, pre-modern ontological and epistemological assumptions and foundations that have not been systematically reformed, nor adapted to respond to the implications of modern technoscience and its planetary effects in reshaping our life world and everydayness. Philosophers of the analytic and continental schools generally feel less restricted in studying Descartes, Kant, or Hegel in comparison with dealing with thinkers from earlier periods. Furthermore, when considering the contributions of philosophers of the Islamic civilizations, this is usually assumed within the folds of medievalist studies, or in some regard, it gravitates towards Islamic studies. The academic value of the philosophers in the Arabic Islamicate milieu is measured ultimately conceptually according to how they facilitate the pedagogic and intellectual understanding of European scholasticism. That's at the philosophical level. Studying the impetus of philosophizing in relation to Islam as a faith and constellation of civilizations from a contemporary standpoint in philosophical thinking remains a desideratum that points to diverse obstacles. Some of these obstacles are historical, since Falsafa is principally posited as being medieval. Or the obstacles are cultural by assuming that Falsafa, and I'm using the term Falsafa here to designate classical and post-classical forms of Arabic philosophy, Arabic Islamicate philosophy and sciences. We assume Falsafa as being incommensurably Oriental and framed as such as being external with respect to what came to be called the West. And this is dominant in circles that are not well familiarized with the legacy of Falsafa. There are also hurdles that are religious in looking at the tradition of Falsafa from a perspective that distinguishes it from the Judeo-Christian traditions, or at best in saying that it has resonances with them. The constraints can be also archival, whereby Falsafa was transmitted in fragments to the European milieu, and some see that its direct intellectual influence disappeared gradually. There are also methodological labyrinths in dealing with historicism, anachronism, precursorism, presentism, determinism, anatopism, and antiquarian orientations in research. There are furthermore Muslim barriers in the sense of resisting prudently, culturally, dogmatically, or politically what some Islamic scholars, historical or contemporary, see as contaminations from alien philosophical concepts that are derived from the so-called West in dealing with fundamentals in Islam, that relate to Quranic exegesis, the handling of hadith, the focus on fiqh, kalam, or Sufism. Questions arise ultimately around the possibilities of how a new contemporary school of falsafa can be formed, while retaining epistemic, hermeneutic, and textual inspirations with the Arabic Islamicate intellectual history. In what ways would it contribute to elucidating contemporary philosophical questions in relationship to religion, technoscience, aesthetics, politics, and ethics? Just like the early Arabic Islamicate philosophers developed their intellectual traditions in response to their encounters with the Greek corpus and the antique bodies of knowledge, and by confronting the theoretical and practical challenges of their own epoch, new forms of falsafa can be shaped in connection with Islam and in direct philosophical engagements with modern thought and modernity. This calls for rethinking the way we grasp the inherited models of picturing the history of philosophy and science, while keeping in view the potentials of generating novel schools of philosophical thinking in our present century, as inspired by commonalities in intellectual histories, which can be aimed at reflecting on the questions concerning truth, goodness, beauty, justice, with an impetus in thinking that seeks renewal in philosophy by rediscovering its ground. We occupy in this a liminal region in between diverse philosophical schools that have synergetic confluences with shared historical origins that can allow for the merging of our horizons in our contemporary philosophical endeavors. The scholarly, rigorous academic endeavors in this regard of the Falsafa project will also underpin cultural direct interactions with the wider public beyond academia by questioning the narratives that separate the emergence of what came to be called the West from its civilizational grounding on the Greco-Roman, Arabic, Latinate legacy, with falsafa as its main locus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nader. We finished ahead of time for this session, which is always nice. So we're going to return at 14:45 UK time, so roughly 36 minutes. So, and we'll return promptly as well, I think. So we'll see you all then. Thank you very much.